Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. I cannot wait for the listeners to experience this conversation that we had the privilege of having. It's a wildly captivating topic that you and I have tried to kind of wrap our heads around for a long time now because it's very applicable to what we talk about on many different levels. But anyway, Tim, what's super applicable to me right now is your mood. How are you?
Doing good over here. Thanks a lot for asking. Yeah, very excited to introduce this conversation with Rebecca Lemov. She has written a new book. It's called The Instability of Truth, Brainwashing, Mind Control, and Hyper-Persuasion. And Lance, we're rubbing elbows with some smart people here because Rebecca is a historian of science at Harvard University. I would say Harvard, but I don't want to embarrass myself. Yeah, this is a great conversation with Rebecca.
You know, you're right. I did feel like we gained so much knowledge after we came out of this conversation with Rebecca, and it isn't necessarily knowledge, and I mean this in all the best ways. This isn't necessarily knowledge that I wanted to have. She talks about this mind control on levels of governments doing it to soldiers, all the way to spouses doing it to each other, and the manipulation that media perpetrates in order to control what you're going to buy and what you're going to even read or watch. One really interesting part of this conversation is the experiment that Facebook did in 2012.
Yeah.
We found super unnerving.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff is unnerving. And, there's just more brainwashing out there than I think we would ever know, unless you've really studied it like Rebecca has. You're not looking at everything around you like that. And she is. It is really interesting, and it's enlightening to be more aware of these kinds of things.
And I walked away from it even thinking, like, are we part of the problem as podcasters? Do we subconsciously try to inflict our opinions into someone else's consciousness? But that thought left my mind pretty quickly because, like, I don't believe we are. That's not to say that some other ones don't do that intentionally.
Yeah, I think we host a lot of conversations and usually ask questions. We usually keep our opinions mostly out of it, but sometimes we'll share at the end of episodes. But yeah, no, I hear you. I think, and it's always good to be aware of yourself, especially if you're a broadcaster like us. So make sure to pick up a copy of Rebecca's book, The Instability of Truth. It is on your bookshelves now,
and we'll put links in the show notes to her website and to all of the platforms in which you can order a copy of her book and her other books. They're fantastic.
Okay, please follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. We're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with Harvard professor Rebecca Lemov.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome to the podcast, Rebecca Lemov. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks. How about you?
We're doing great, and we're looking forward to this conversation as much as one can look forward to this topic that you're going to bring to the table. I'm kind of nervous. We've had some people on in the past few months that have spoken about a similar subject matter, kind of more in the court of domestic abuse and violence amongst partners. But you cast a much wider net with this, and it's kind of terrifying. But before we get into that, can you just introduce yourself for the listeners?
Sure. Thank you. Well, let's see. I have cast a wide net. I'm interested in this topic of brainwashing for the past 25 years or so, and I've been pursuing it as a graduate student in anthropology, and also I've then later become a professor at Harvard. I've taught also at the University of Washington, and I've just been kind of carrying this topic with me wherever I go. And I'm currently in a department called History of Science. So I do study history, but I also am very interested in how history plays out in the present and how it with certain changes and how you can benefit from those patterns. I'm also, just as a person, interested in applying my own experiences to what I study. So a lot of this does have a personal motivation. So it probably does connect with some of the other conversations we've been having.
You've written a couple of books and a new one that's coming out in a couple of weeks as we speak here today. It's called The Instability of Truth, Brainwashing, Mind Control, and Hyper Persuasion. Can you tell us a little bit about this new book?
So this is the result of many decades of study and teaching about the topic of brainwashing. But I decided a few years ago to consolidate it and try to string it together as well as I could, because the topic of brainwashing, when I came to it, it seemed like this extremely obscure niche topic. And in fact, if you look at a Google Ngram, the word brainwashing in the early 2000s, it was at a low point of use, and people just used it as a kind of a joke, like that would never happen. Or, they used to worry about that in the 70s or the 60s or, maybe the Cold War, but surely this isn't something that a rational person has to be concerned about. And maybe only silly people find themselves in those situations, or cults or things like that. But as we all know, there's been a huge revival of interest in cults and controlling processes and mass formations. And these questions have always interested me. So a few years ago during my sabbatical, I just decided to put everything together that I knew. And that includes a lot of time in the archives of people who are influential in defining brainwashing and doing, I guess you could call it cutting edge research for the CIA and various other things. So I tried to put it all together in this book. And I got the title from my mother. Actually, I'd been in conversation with her. She's a journalist. And I was saying, really what the book is about is the instability of truth. It's not the end of truth, but a post-truth world or something like that. It's really about how in different conditions the truth becomes unstable and therefore we become unstable. And she said, write that down because that's a good title.
So I guess we really have to go back to the beginning here. I've been interested in brainwashing from like the, cinematic sense, like that old movie, the Manchurian Candidate. When I watched the original of that, I just remember being so creeped out. Like it just gets so under your skin that this could happen to someone who is of rational mind, and you just find a little crack in their rationality, and you can infiltrate that and get the weaknesses, and then you can plant your seeds. But when I watched it as a kid, I wasn't like, I'm going to make this my life. I'm not going to make this into a career. What started you on this path? What got you interested into brainwashing?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the Manchurian Candidate, especially the first film, because it is a very disquieting film and kind of a nightmare. It doesn't create an aspiration to either become the Frank Sinatra character who has terrible nightmares and spends most of the movie sweating, or the guy who was honored as a war hero but turns out to be totally programmed by his communist captors. And I didn't imagine myself as someone who would get into that dark of a territory either, certainly not as a kid. I think I pretty much went through life until graduate school trying to just trying to have as many accomplishments as possible and do the right thing, or not, had various crises. But once I got to graduate school, a couple of things happened. First of all, I took on the topic, I got really interested in scientific experiments in control and human engineering. I just was thinking, if you study the way behaviorists and behavioral scientists had tried to create these kind of systems that would model a society in which people would inherently want what was best for society and therefore would self-edit their own freedoms. And if you look at the long history of rats running through mazes under many different conditions, that's what I was writing my dissertation about. But I ended up having some personal experience in this kind of, I guess you could say, loss of freedom through both. One is kind of funny, which is that when I was in graduate school, there was this kind of fashion for writing to imitate the French theorists like Derrida and, these kind of post-structuralists or things like that. So I think that I became swept up in this trend to try to sound really smart and make my writing incomprehensible, as if that was a measure of it. So I don't write like that anymore. But there was a moment when a friend of mine looked at something I'd written. I was really proud of it because it's kind of the edge of even being understandable. And he was like, that doesn't even sound like you. And I thought, how funny that you could become not like yourself and not even realize it. In my personal life as well, something much darker happened, which is that I kind of fell into a period of addiction and serious drug use, and then a relationship which was caught up in that. Even though I never thought of myself as that kind of person, or I actually didn't really think this could happen to me. After a couple of years, I really found it difficult to get out, and it was became quite a dangerous situation. So it gave me a lot of insight into the topics I'd been writing about, which were until then more theoretical.
I'm curious, what are the conditions that are ideally in place for brainwashing to occur?
I mean, one of the most famous conditions is set forth by Robert J. Lifton, who's a great psychiatrist. And he says it's milieu control, which is really the control of information coming into an environment. So if you happen to be in a prison camp or a cult or a terrible relationship where you get cut off from friends and family, you're going to be in an inherently siloed environment. But what I argue in my book is I became interested in something I call ungrounding, which I think precedes milieu control. And it can take place in several steps, but really I think of it as a process of sustaining successive shocks to the point of disorientation. So this could happen like in wartime, but it could also happen in somebody's life. Say they're going through a transition, they're ungrounded, things that you were normally used to have changed, and it actually creates a kind of opening for a potential, I guess you could say, mind control or brainwashing, or just actually it creates all kinds of potential. But so I have many examples in the book of this, like what happened during the Korean War to the soldiers who underwent brainwashing.
So does this stem from shock therapy? People are institutionalized and the administration is applying shock therapy. Is that along the same lines where you just keep shocking somebody to the point where no matter what you tell them, that's going to be the truth?
I suppose that's a kind of brutal example, but it's a brutal form of coercive control, and it also has physiological effects on the brain. And I suppose, I mean, I'm not a physician myself, but the return of certain types of electroshock therapy under controlled conditions actually has been found to be effective in intractable depression, which probably is because it sort of destabilizes patterns of the thinking. But with brainwashing, what I find interesting about it is, I mean, a great short definition of brainwashing is coercive persuasion. So it's not simply coercion. It's not simply brutal torture. It's not simply what you can do to a person, because actually that doesn't break a person. It's the combination of a type of coercion with persuasion. And often there's a buy-in by the person. You have to say yes at a certain point. And I think some people who underwent shock therapy never did. And likewise with several, terrible types of, lobotomy and things like that.
I'm just thinking about like the news cycle that we see today and how everything is just like one after the other of, well, they call it doom scrolling, but you get all of this bad stuff until it just becomes so normal that the next piece of bad news just doesn't feel as bad as it would have because you've been so desensitized to it. And that just automatically just puts my brain into that point of like, or into that example of shock therapy. But with the coercion, that's more of a gradual process. And you said that the person has to have a buy-in on it as well. Can you just explore that a little bit more?
Yeah. So I do make an analogy to doom scrolling. I mean, I think there is a buy-in. I mean, the strategy of the book is to spend the first 2/3 talking about the past and the last part of the book talking about the present. And it may seem that somebody being stuck in a prisoner of war camp in Korea, being guarded by Chinese officials and forced into indoctrination programs, or likewise someone being pulled into a terribly abusive cult by some figure like Manson, may have little to do with the tiny decisions we all make regarding our phones or not being able to stop scrolling. There are certain similarities. One is that there is buy-in in your phone, obviously. You're making tiny decisions all the time. So it could be, there are differences in the time frame, but I think one commonality is this idea of ungrounding. You can put yourself in a situation where you're progressively ungrounded. And I would argue that today we all kind of are being ungrounded just because systems and institutions to which we're used to are falling apart or failing to function in certain ways. And meanwhile, these new, partly understood platforms, galvanize attention, destabilize assumptions. There's actually scientific papers on doom scrolling that are kind of fascinating, just about how they capture and rededicate one's attention over time. So you're perpetually renewing your yes, in a sense, even while you're horrified and wishing you could be elsewhere.
You're explaining like the terms and conditions of all of these platforms that we just don't read because it's like 1,000 pages long and so dense, but you accept that's your entry.
Yeah. I mean, nobody reads them. You really, unless it's your full-time job, and even if it is your full-time job, nobody reads the terms and conditions. And yet, as the Facebook experiment of 2012 and to 14 showed, you are agreeing to become an experimental subject, to have different conditions tested on you. And that's quite literally true. So there's lots of connections there. And I think it's useful to look at more what I call hard brainwashing and apply it to what we think of as soft brainwashing. But in a way, it's hard to know what's hard and what's soft sometimes.
What is the difference?
I mean, I think intuitively hard brainwashing involves something we would identify as a bystander, as an extreme situation that most people won't experience. So being, an extreme situation of abuse or being held prisoner behind the 49th parallel during, in 1953, during the Korean War, being deprived of food. And I can describe the conditions more explicitly, but so on the one hand, hard brainwashing would be an extreme deprivation, even torture, things like that. It could involve torture at some point. But soft brainwashing would be something we don't even necessarily recognize. It could be subtle, pervasive. It takes place over a much longer time frame. So to go back to hard brainwashing, a famous example is Cardinal Mindszenty. He was a high-level Hungarian religious official. He was a World War II hero. He had this incredible reputation, and he was arrested by the Hungarian police and kept for 28 days. And during those 28 days, he was subjected to, some physical abuse. He was somewhat elderly, but not terribly old. But he was more like he was manipulated. He was made to wear a clown's costume. He had to, crawl around on his hands and knees to get food. And his food was delivered to him covered with grime. And he thinks he might have been drugged, but he wasn't sure. He was sleep deprived. He was subjected to these intensive conditions that after 28 days when he was released, he was put in front of the newsreel cameras and he looked like a zombie. This was almost an announcement to the US and the Western world that the communists had this kind of secret weapon where they could change somebody. And Mindszenty himself said, looking back, that he didn't recognize himself. He said, without knowing what had happened to me, I had become another person, a different person. And he hadn't even realized it. That's an example of hard brainwashing where he could look back at it later, but in a very relatively compressed period of time, he had become someone else. Comparing that to soft brainwashing, it's a murky territory, but I like to think of it as, subtle things that seem almost meaningless in just ordinary parts of human life, but we are subjected to a kind of bombardment of messages that seem trivial, but at the same time, they can have a cumulative effect.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
And you go into the use of brainwashing during warfare, Korean War, and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about that, like some examples of how that's used and for what purposes?
During the Korean War, I think, so there were hundreds of US and UN soldiers who were captured, and many of them were very young, as with many wars. One soldier I write about was named Morris Wills. He was a high school student, not even a senior, but a junior in high school, and he decided to enlist at 17. His father wasn't sure. His mother had died when he was 14, and he came from a pretty middle-class family that owned a farm. And 2 weeks later, he's in Korea. He doesn't even know what this is because the U.S. hadn't declared it a war yet. It was just a police action, and he thought maybe he'd be patrolling in a police car. But it turns out they're, in the middle of intensive fighting in this freezing terrain. He's just toting boxes of ammunition back and forth, and he's relatively quickly captured by North Korean troops. During the next couple of months, he loses almost half of his body weight. Many people just simply died from sheer exhaustion and not having their wounds untreated, things like that. He was marched north with others, and they were held in camps. So the brainwashing didn't occur until the troops got to those northern camps, which were north of the Yalu River. And in the camps, originally they were run by the North Koreans, and during that period, the soldiers continued to experience incredible deprivation. Like they would simply die overnight just because they couldn't stand to live anymore. In fact, one guy in an oral history said a friend of him just couldn't take the food they were given, which was like a tiny bit of millet with worms in it. And he said his friend became obsessed with hamburgers, and he just died thinking about it because he just became obsessed with this thing he couldn't have that had once been so plentiful in his life. And some people died just there was a pit latrine and they would fall in and they didn't even have the strength to crawl out of it. It was demoralizing for others to see their compatriots dying that way. And they had been promised they would be home for Thanksgiving, but it was several months past. And they would end up spending years there. That period was also significant under the North Korean guards. But then the Chinese came in, and this is where the real formal mind control happened, was that, and you could say these men had already been ungrounded, and, the horrors they had experienced were something I got really interested in because people just don't know about it. Once the Chinese came in, they kind of ran an experiment where they applied formal Maoist indoctrination methods, which had been applied to a large part of the Chinese population up to that point. And they basically divided US troops into classes. And they said the GIs are really like peasants. They're usually from the lower classes. So we'll apply, typical peasant thought reform to them, which took place in 3 phases. And then the higher level military would be subjected to harder methods. Anyway, so it was, in a sense, an experiment to see if the Maoist method would also work on American GIs.
And what was the result of that?
It did work. I think it worked better than they thought. Not for everyone. Mm-hmm. This is what caused a national emergency, was that it worked all too well. It was said that something like 75% of the men who returned from the camps, even if they hadn't capitulated, that they showed signs of indoctrination, like they had written letters home praising the communist ideals and condemning capitalism. Or the Chinese also used the rampant racism in the United States as a weapon. So they would speak to conditions that people could recognize. But anyway, some of them had made broadcasts. And so many of the men who returned home showed this, and they were studied, or some of them were quarantined because they were seen as having been infected by a mind virus of some sort. Probably the greatest success from the Chinese point of view is that 21 of the GIs elected not to even return to the United States and decided to try their lot in China because they thought it might be a better system. And they had very interesting fates as well.
Can you give us an example?
Like I said, the experiment was sort of off the cuff. Chairman Mao did come visit the camps, so he was involved to some degree, hands-on. All the soldiers in the war during the armistice were given a choice. So the North Koreans could also choose. So it may be that the Chinese were actually surprised that 21 decided not even to go home. But so once they had them, they sort of took them on a bus to China, gave them a banquet, and then dispersed them throughout different echelons of society. Some of them went to work in the field, some of them went to work in chicken factories, but 5 of them were seen as the most educatable, so they were sent to Chinese universities. And one of those men was the guy I was talking about, Morris Wills, who had managed to survive being captured, coming from the farm, being captured, being held for years. He also talks about the process by which he was brainwashed. He says it's a long, horrible process. He became really demoralized about his own country. And he said also he was very unprepared to counter brainwashing because he'd never been told about Marx. He'd never been taught about Marxism, so he had no way to defend himself. Anyway, he went to China and he went to Beijing University, and he initially had sort of a good time for various reasons. I think it was a new society. He fell in love. He was surprised to find that the Chinese didn't actually want him to marry the woman he fell in love with. So he made really good friends at first, but after he graduated, he discovered that he was losing status. And this was the time when the pre-Cultural Revolution was starting. So foreigners were starting to be suspected. So first they would be given honorifics like honored friend, honored colleague. But over time, he noticed that he was being addressed in more and more disrespectful ways until he was finally just the equivalent of like, dude. And he realized that his time was almost up and that he was actually in danger of being arrested. Also, they put his soon-to-be wife in prison, trying to dissuade her from marrying him. And so he persisted with that relationship, and they were both allowed to leave with their young child in 1965. They managed to walk out of China across into Hong Kong and came back to the U.S. There are several interesting stories, too, about this, but he readapted to life in the U.S.
How do you see the return on that happening? How does somebody reprogram their mind, and how do they do that without thinking like the reprogramming is also a form of brainwashing?
One of the paradoxes of brainwashing is that the cure for it is often deprogramming. What you call deprogramming, which is essentially the same thing. It's just a rapid and I mean, there's a famous, in the world of cults, there was a whole movement called deprogramming that they no longer call it that because it's kind of illegal. I mean, it involved kidnapping people, keeping them in a room and making them adopt a new set of beliefs. And the thing about brainwashing, even as Mao described it, is it's never truly permanent. It always has to be renewed. Even Chairman Mao said, I have to renew my own thoughts. That's why people in China would continually be sent back, or if they were seen to be slipping. So when Morris Wills came back to the US, actually there's not he writes about it a little bit in his autobiography, but it's a pretty brutal transition because you come back suspected. I mean, the FBI and the military did extensive investigations of him. And he came back, in the 60s. So some of the men who did return, just barely returned with their lives in some cases. And they'd been completely disillusioned with the communist system, but they weren't necessarily happy to be back in the US or sure how to feel. And sometimes they were immediately investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee, had to come and defend their choices. Actually, the UN had made it legal to make that choice. So in a sense, they weren't really traitors. They just had been subjected to unimaginable brutality, but the response in the US was rarely compassionate. It was, the press would hound them. They'd be seen as weak or cowards or freaks or various things. So they really had a hard time. One guy, Clarence Adams, was almost lynched when he returned because he was African American. He was seen as someone who had collaborated. When his train came back to Memphis on his return in 1966, there was a crowd gathered to attack him, but he took a different train. This is worth an entire book, and I do recommend his, he wrote a book, or his daughter put together a bunch of interviews with him. Incredible story. But basically, he'd grown up in segregated Memphis, and he signed up for the military. He couldn't even walk on the main street once he grew up into his 20s. He had very limited opportunities. So he signed up for the military. He went to fight in Korea, and when he was captured, and it was still segregated, even though it was officially desegregated military. So when he was captured, the Chinese actually, or the North Koreans and then the Chinese, would speak to him about how he'd have much better opportunities in China and how they understood the racist conditions in the US. And Adams knew that to be true. I mean, that resonated with his own experience. So when he was actually captured, instead of putting him under arrest, they handed him a cigarette and gave him a hug because he was Black. They pulled him out of a hole where he'd been hiding. And he also had the complicating experience of having been betrayed by his own commander who was in the field. So he had many real reasons for trying a different way of life. But similar to Morris Wills, once he was in China, over the years, he discovered that it wasn't a paradise there either. The racism was not as pervasive, but he was still, seen as different. And after a while, just because he was a foreigner, he was being put under suspicion. So he eventually decided to come back. He became fluent in Chinese, and he also brought his Chinese wife back with him and their 2 kids. It's kind of an amazing story. They resettled in Memphis, and after a time of incredible hardship and alienation from their own families, because they hesitated to accept a Chinese relative and the kids. But after a while they did. And in the 70s, they opened a really successful Chinese restaurant in Memphis, which was apparently the first one there.
So it all worked out.
It's kind of a heroic story, I think.
Yeah, you said that it probably could be its own book in itself. So we look forward to you coming back on the show to discuss that one. But can you talk about this individual, I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Louis Jolyon West?
Oh, yes. So I say Louis Jolyon West. I
like calling him Louis.
Let's call him Louis.
He's a Louis to me.
He actually also went by the nickname Jolly.
Right.
That was his personality, though I never met him. But I've spent many, many hours in his archives, and he's one of those people who seem to have kept everything. He was a psychiatrist trained by the military. He came from an immigrant background, grew up in Wisconsin from Ukrainian Jewish parents. So he accepted a military scholarship to go to college and then medical school. Early on was trained with some of the people who would end up running MKUltra. I think he gravitated to that work because even when he was a medical student, because he was really interested in hypnosis. In those years, that was when MKUltra was starting up. This was a program that was funded in response to the brainwashing crisis of the men coming back, seeming to have been subjected to some weapon that the U.S. didn't understand. So MKUltra was secretly funded by the CIA, and West presented himself as someone who on his own had creative ideas that the CIA would be interested in. So he connected with Sid Gottlieb, the head of MKUltra, and he received basically carte blanche to do whatever he wanted within, the budget he had. He was affiliated with the military, and he was serving as the head psychiatrist at Lackland Air Force Base after he graduated from medical school and did his residency. He was at Lackland. He wanted to have a laboratory, freely experiment in the dimensions of creating dissociative states through LSD, hypnosis, and sleep deprivation. Those were his three prongs of interest. And he thought if you could combine them in various ways, you could probably create a machine or sort of a really reliable way to create a kind of brainwash state.
So is he a good guy or a bad guy?
So he's a really confusing guy. I think that he did some really questionable things, definitely. I mean, one of the things that he didn't publish everything he did, although he did publish quite a bit. One of the things he did was administer LSD to an elephant in 1962 and publish about it in Science. Some people know about this. I mean, it's sometimes talked about on the internet, various things. But the thing that people don't know, so he found an elephant at the Oklahoma Zoo that he was allowed to give a significant dose of LSD to. But the thing people don't know is that he was trying to discover so elephants are known to go into an aggressive state called must, although they're usually pacific animals. They can turn into these kind of raging monsters. So he wanted to find if there was an on-off button to the elephant aggression. And he talks about it in the Science article. That's why he administered LSD to see if that might be a trigger. And in general, he was interested in finding triggers to behavioral change, and whether that could be through extreme sleep deprivation, through hypnosis, or through LSD, or some combination of those things. He was quite interested. So I don't know to say if he was good or bad. He's one of those figures that's kind of extremely complex. And sometimes I feel, since I've been studying him for so long, I feel that I don't fully understand him, but I do know quite a bit about what he did.
I mean, I guess you could say he was just a product of the environment and a product of the times and just kind of doing what he thought was going to be the best thing to do in his field.
He certainly did think of himself as a patriot, and he was, and in some ways he really was. It's kind of interesting. Later he became a cult expert. He defended Patty Hearst. He became the head of the Neuropsychiatric Institute at UCLA. He just was this huge name in psychiatry. So those later days, he denied that he ever worked for the CIA, but the paper trail is very, very clear. The more questionable things he did were, I suppose, early on. It's not just that he was asked by the CIA to work for them and do these extreme experiments. It's that he did them with such zeal and enthusiasm. And there is some evidence that he also worked with Charles Manson, that his group in the late 60s, before Manson's family committed the murders they did, that West was actually, we can definitely place him in the same building. And he also was the lead investigator of the Amphetamine Research Project, which was a conglomerate of studies that included a study of the Manson family as in an ethnographic manner. So they were sending social scientists out to hang out with Manson and his girls. This was before the murders were committed. There's a lot of connections that are still being investigated, for example, by Tom O'Neill, if you've read that book, Chaos. Have you read this book?
No, haven't read it.
No.
That's a page turner.
I don't know if I want to read it.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
A little while ago, you mentioned Facebook. Could you tell us about this experiment that they conducted on their users?
Yes. As I was mentioning, they will frequently do A/B testing to see how people respond to different conditions, colors or how you change the scroll or the feed or the algorithm. But in 2012, Facebook actually did a very formal experiment that they then published in a really prominent academic journal called PNAS. And this experiment, they took about 700,000 users without telling them, because of the user agreement, people could be swept up into an experiment. And basically they divided them into subgroups. And one of the subgroups, they altered the algorithm to make it more positive. And another group, they made it more negative in terms of emotional content in the news feed. And then they measured how these changes affected what people were posting. So they basically the stimulus was changed and they wanted to see what the response was. And they also varied the amount of negativity that was placed into each feed or positivity. And they had a control group as well, where they didn't vary the algorithm at all. So the people whose feed was altered positively also started posting more positive emotional content. The people whose feed was altered negatively posted more negatively, and that was relative also to the degree of alteration. And so this was statistically significant, and the negative effect was even more striking than the positive, though they both existed. And so they concluded that they had proved mass emotional contagion could exist across a network without face-to-face contact, because people had understood that emotional contagion was possible or happens among humans, but it wasn't yet understood up to that point that it could be enacted across a digital network. And they published this paper called Mass Emotional Contagion at Scale. And that came out in 2014. It caused a huge outcry that is, I think, largely forgotten today, but it had many interesting effects. Among them, that Facebook never again published a paper on that topic. Because I think they were it was almost a kind of a landmark, like they were announcing, we can now do this. And it is sort of a pride in both the types of resources they had, but also the effectiveness of it, and that it could be scientifically proved in a proper journal and things like that. But subsequently, I think that the fallout was so negative for them that they just stopped. I don't think they stopped the activity necessarily, but they definitely stopped publishing about it. And a scientist I met, a computer scientist who spent time there, I met after one of my talks, and he told me that was indeed true, that they were told not to publish about anything on this sensitive area.
I have two follow-up questions on that. To what end is this experiment meant to display? And the other one is when you said they were told not to publish, who told them not to publish?
The Facebook research team.
Oh, okay.
Which is where it came out of. They have a team that does research, is like dedicated to research, not simply engineers who are working on the user experience or various other things. So they cite the scientific literature on emotional contagion, which goes back to a 1990 paper, and they also cite other academic resources. So what I sensed is that they were trying to find a place in the respectable literature, kind of. And also they were trying to operationalize. They actually say that in the paper. We've now operationalized contagion. What I got interested in, people have talked about this. It's really just a claim, putting a claim and proving it in the scientific literature, which is what people do a lot in the scientific literature. It's just that it became very sensitive because users started writing in saying, can I know if I was in this experiment? And during those dates that you were manipulating the feeds, I went into a mental health emergency room with suicidal ideation. Was I someone in that experiment? And nobody would ever know that. They could never trace it back. So there were ethical concerns and there were investigations. UK system started investigating, but none of the people involved in the study were sanctioned. In fact, they were all promoted to even better positions. But what I was interested in is really the link to trauma, which hasn't been talked about, because I looked at the way that the software they use to count, like how do you measure what's an emotionally positive versus an emotionally negative content? They use word counting software that has its own kind of history, and that counting software was actually trained on the diaries of people who were asked in a scientific study to journal about the worst experiences of their lives. And then they pulled from that the kind of words that they used to measure. So, in a kind of literal way, it's built on traumatic experiences. As an example of emotional contagion, they draw on this famous autobiography by Vivian Gornick, where she describes this toxic relationship with her mother and how it embodies emotional contagion. So in some ways, this kind of concept of emotional contagion built in people's traumas is what I'm arguing, and that's not usually recognized.
So besides staying off of Facebook, how can we protect ourselves from brainwashing on social media?
That is a good question. The conclusion I come to, and I come to this from, I was telling you earlier about my personal experience of being caught in a situation that I thought I would never find myself in. And once I feel very fortunate to have gotten out of it, and I learned to meditate, and I've meditated for 2 or more hours a day for the last 25 years. And then I kind of use this as a form of research too, in observation. And I think it's not so much what platform you're on or how long, or it's the quality of attention you bring to it and understanding. What I think my research reveals is it's not about the extremity of your situation, because it's really built into ordinariness as well. Like even if you look at, hard brainwashing, their experiences are made up of ordinariness as well. Like the guy who couldn't forget hamburgers and died of it, or, all these things. And if you look at what seems like an ordinary experience of being lost in a doom scroll, it's actually quite momentous where you put your attention. If you look at the stories of people who get caught in cults, it's just they happen to be in a place during a certain day when they encountered someone at a bus stop who had nefarious intent, who were misrepresented, or who took advantage of their loneliness, or who whatever, that there's this capacity in every moment. And I kind of conclude about the book is that it's useful to think about or notice if you start thinking other people are brainwashed, because what I want to argue is that we're all capable of it at certain moments, and that it's not about other people. It's a collective, it's a potential that we all are exposed to.
Other than social media platforms, what are the other forms of modern day brainwashing that we are experiencing at this moment?
That is a very good question. You could be exposed to a number of cult-like groups. I think our politics is full of all kinds of manipulative and destabilizing messages that I wouldn't locate it like according to party, but just to say that the extreme polarization is actually typical of a highly charged environment where people are in danger of falling into milieus where you'll be siloed and where the information will be restricted, or you may choose to restrict the information that you're exposed to. So I think that we're kind of in a dangerous situation, not to make people afraid, but I use it as more of an empowering message that we all have the capability at every moment just to be aware of just make it a choice of what you're exposing yourself to and think about it, or kind of make a little space between the stimulus and the response. I've had this experience myself, and that's why I bring myself into the book. Even just small things, like the other day, my family said, "You're spending a lot of time on Instagram." And I was like, "No, I'm not. I'm using it for research or something." But I realized, and I decided to stop doing it just for a month to see. And I realized, yeah, it had been kind of affecting me. So just using your own experience as a kind of your own laboratory, so you don't become part of somebody else's experiment.
Have you ever seen the movie They Live?
No.
I think it might be late 80s, John Carpenter movie. They have to put on sunglasses and they see all of the hidden messages that are behind all of this consumerism stuff. And when it came out, I don't think anyone really took it that seriously until now. And now we're seeing these parodies of They Live. What's your interpretation, or what's your thoughts on how the media, how we talked about the Manchurian Candidate, how does that negatively and positively affect people's grip of actual brainwashing, and not as from a fictionalized story?
So I haven't seen They Live, but I know my husband has, and he's really into such movies. And I think there's a real connection with the two greatest brainwashing movies are The Manchurian Candidate and Invasion of the Body Snatchers. In both of which, I was thinking about this morning, both of which are interesting because the experts are wrong, deeply wrong in both cases. Either the experts are nefariously or enacting brain control, or they're just interpreting it as just a psychological thing and you're just imagining it. That person really is your mother. This couldn't happen. I want to connect that to the media. I think we're in a deeply unstable time in terms of the media environment. We see that even the idea of legacy media, that we have to call it that, and that a CBS News broadcast probably gets fewer viewers than certain podcasts. I mean, it definitely does get fewer. So it's a highly unstable environment where things people thought they could just turn to as reliable are now just put into question. And I think that creates, even in the media itself, a kind of confusion. I mean, people are really confused about what their role is. And it also creates further polarization. So they think, oh, then I need to double down on, a certain brand that I'm known for, or be very stern and lecturing. You can see this response in the legacy media of being disdainful of alternative, or turning the phrase, do your own research, into an insult. Like anyone who does their own research is not qualified to do that. But in a sense, that's what we all need to be doing. And that can be kind of daunting. So I think the media it's both powerful, but it's not powerful in the same ways it has been in the past. And I think that's a huge part of the picture of what we're all experiencing.
Wow, Rebecca. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. Where do you like to tell folks to get your book?
By the time you hear this, it'll be out. I think you can get it just about anywhere books are sold. I have a website at my university, and I have a separate website as well. So I look forward to hearing from people.
Awesome. Well done with the book, and well done with all of your books and all of the work that you've done in this field. I feel like I would get so kind of wrapped up in the idea of it. So just like one final question, like, does this ever frustrate you? Like you can't seem to say it loud enough?
I don't know if it frustrates me so much as sometimes it's pretty dark. And yeah. When I came back to the topic to actually write the book, I spent a whole year. I basically self-funded my a year off. And it felt like very heavy sometimes because there's so much suffering. And one of the themes of my book is just that a lot of the suffering was not acknowledged or it wasn't even visible to people, like the POWs or some people who've been in cults or just people who've been subjected to experiments. So anyway, that's part of it. But I also find a lot of pleasure in hopefully transforming it into a book that people will enjoy reading. Like it's not just a terrible book, I think, because I love writing. I think some of the stories are just amazing. So it's a lucky thing to get to do with your life.